One of the most powerful religious arguments from evolution is from utilitarianism, and that's the subject of this video. Now, as context, in an earlier video we looked at religious rationalism, 17th century religious rationalism and deism. And those traditions required a couple of things. One was a natural pathway to a saving faith. So there had to be evidences and reasons and logic for a belief in God, evidences for God that were natural, from nature. There also needed to be a system of ethics. How can we know what to do in order to please God, in order to be saved? That need for a system of ethics kind of paved the way for utilitarianism, 18th century utilitarianism. Utilitarianism was championed by Jeremy Bentham. There were others, but he was the most famous, hardest working exponent, champion of utilitarianism. And so when people hear the term utilitarianism, they think system of ethics, Jeremy Bentham. You may have learned about it in your ethics class or political science class. Utilitarianism is a secular system of ethics. But utilitarianism is broader and more influential than that. Of interest here is its theological side. There was a theological side to utilitarianism as it entered into Origen's thinking, 18th century Origen's thinking. And for many that's going to mean natural theology, but more than just natural theology. But for natural theology, there were certain natural theologians who adopted utilitarian thinking in their interpretation of natural theology. Again, natural theology was looking for the evidences or finding evidences of God in creation, of design, of the Creator in the creation. One of its most famous exponents was William Paley toward the end of the 18th century. And Paley did adopt a utilitarian view and made utilitarian type arguments. God, in the hands of Paley, was a good utilitarian. Now let me explain a little bit about the secular system of ethics first. So this starts to, you can see the consistency in thought here. Jeremy Bentham's basic idea for his utilitarianism, was what he called the greatest happiness principle. And the greatest happiness principle stated that we ought to act in a way to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. You can think of it as a ratio. The pleasure to pain ratio needs to be maximized. Well, William Paley, the natural theologian, argued that God created the world in such a way as to ensure the happiness of his creatures. Everything's going to work well in this world for the creatures. A utilitarian type argument. Now, later natural theologians in the early 19th century pushed back against Paley. One of them was Adam Sedgwick, a leading natural theologian kind of in the tail end of the movement. And he admired Paley and agreed with much of what he said, but he said, he went too far with that utilitarianism. It's not good, did not make sense. So you had natural theologians pushing back against this utilitarianism that had entered into Origen's thinking. Now it's important to understand that in this Origen's thinking, utilitarianism had become a theological doctrine. It should be obvious from what I just said. Paley was talking about how God created the world for happiness for his creatures. So it had become a theological doctrine. So whereas with Bentham it was a secular system of ethics in the hands of the natural theologians and the Origen's thinking at the time, it turned toward a theological doctrine. So to summarize so far, we have a secular system of ethics championed by Jeremy Bentham, and then we have natural theologians such as William Paley employing utilitarianism in their natural theology, and then later other natural theologians pushing back, rejecting the utilitarianism that had entered into natural theology. And utilitarianism had become a theological tradition or a theological doctrine in this Origen's thinking. Now that's interesting because contemporary scholarship has often overestimated the role of utilitarianism in natural theology. Contemporary scholarship has often said that natural theology was utilitarian. At its core, it was utilitarian through and through, and that natural theologians were always and just referring to utility and how well adapted everything was in the natural world and everything works so perfectly. The fact is, they often were appealing to exactly the opposite. Things occurred just for pleasure, just for reasons of delight or beauty, things like that, things that don't necessarily aren't for a purpose. And so the historians have not always accurately rendered the nuances of natural theology, put it that way. I wrote up about this whole topic of this video in a recent journal paper. I put the link down below in the description so you can see that. I can't cover all the details in this video, so see that paper for more details. But the bottom line here is that yes, natural theologians did make appeals to utilitarianism or how well things work, but by no means were they exclusively looking at that. And in fact, they looked at the opposite of that, and they pushed back against going too far with utilitarianism, as they felt William Paley had. Now, evolutionary thought, on the other hand, was much more utilitarian. Utilitarianism played a major role, a fundamental role, in the emerging evolutionary thought of Charles Darwin and others. And by others, I'll mention Robert Chambers and his Vestiges of the Creation, 1844. He published that under a pseudonym. Chambers was a publisher and had ideas about origins and wrote this book on origins and why he thought that the world arose via naturalistic means. It wasn't really a deeply scientific book, more like science fiction, but he had a lot of these religious arguments, including arguments from utilitarianism and how rudimentary structures, rudimentary organs, or other such things just didn't work very well, and that we couldn't believe that the Creator would have created these things. They must have evolved somehow. Again, this was 1844. The book made quite a stir, didn't provide the scientific details, or at least scientific patina, that Darwin did 15 years later in his Origin of Species. But by that time, a lot of the debate had been conducted because of this Vestiges book that Chambers had written. It encouraged a lot of thinking about this. People now were more accepting of these ideas. And of course, there were critics of Vestiges. One of them was Adam Sedgwick, whom we mentioned earlier. Sedgwick was harshly critical of Vestiges. And can you guess what one of his criticisms was? Yes, it was the utilitarianism that was inherent in Robert Chambers's Vestiges. Just as Sedgwick had criticized William Paley's utilitarianism in the natural theology context, now he was criticizing the utilitarianism that was evident, that was used by Chambers in an evolutionary context. The argument being these structures we observe don't work very well. There's disutility in nature. Therefore, God must not have created it. Paley said that everything had all this great utility. Well, here's some disutility. It must not have been created. It must have evolved. Sedgwick picked up on that and harshly criticized that. No, it didn't necessarily have to evolve. God could have done it that way for various reasons, such as the natural theologians had been talking about. Sedgwick's criticism of the utilitarianism in Vestiges was entirely in keeping with natural theology, the traditions of natural theology that were by no means wedded to utilitarianism. So that was consistent, but it really undercut evolutionary thinking and what was one of the strongest, if not the strongest, arguments for evolution, and that was the utilitarian argument. Now, switch over to Darwin for a minute. Darwin, as a young man, had read Paley and had agreed with what Paley wrote, was impressed with Paley, had no reason to disagree. It all seemed very logical and very powerful. The natural theology was a powerful argument, a powerful movement. Darwin agreed with that as a young man. But as he went out into the world and explored nature, he found increasingly things that didn't look quite right. Examples of disutility. And so, well, if God would have created everything perfectly with everything fitted exactly together in utility, then what did disutility indicate? Disutility was a powerful argument for Darwin, maybe his most powerful, the one that he was swayed by the most. It made him an evolutionist. He went into this as a utilitarian, a paleo-utilitarian, and came out of it an evolutionist, a very strong evolutionist, but it was based on this utilitarian problem, or what Darwin consistently referred to as the disutility in nature. He found a lot of examples of that and wrote about it in his Origin of Species book as powerful arguments, powerful evidences for his new theory of evolution. Well, this meant that Darwin and his theory of evolution were contingent upon this theological doctrine of utilitarianism. It also meant that Sedgwick and people like Sedgwick who were criticizing this utilitarianism were threats. They threatened what was probably the most powerful argument for Darwin. The most powerful evidence was undercut by these natural theologians such as Sedgwick, who were questioning and expressing that utilitarianism was wrong. It was not correct. It was a false view, a false interpretation, a false theology. This was a threat to Darwin. So Darwin addressed this in his book Origin of Species, and he said outright, my theory is contingent on utilitarianism, and there are these people out there, these natural theologians who are doubting utilitarianism. If they're right, I'm wrong. My theory would be absolutely demolished. Let me read to you what Darwin wrote about this in chapter 6. The foregoing remarks lead me to say a few words on the protests lately made by some naturalists, read Adam Sedgwick, for example, against the utilitarian doctrine, that every detail of structure has been produced for the good of its possessor. They believe that many structures have been created for the sake of beauty, to delight man or the Creator, or for the sake of mere variety. If true, such doctrines would be absolutely fatal to my theory. So there you have it. Darwin makes a clear admission. He clearly states, he's letting the reader know, my theory is contingent on, it entails and requires the theological doctrine of utilitarianism. Without it, it is absolutely fatal. In black and white, Darwin is telling the reader, my theory is a religious theory. He can do this, he can make this admission because he's so confident that the evidence is so powerful. And he goes on in this passage to cite examples of what he considers to be disutility and how they prove his theory to be true. I'll read to you an example here. Thus we can hardly believe that the webbed feet of the upland goose or of the frigate bird are of special use to these birds. We may safely attribute these structures to inheritance. So you've got these birds that are not there, don't normally go near the water, yet they have webbed feet. So there you have it, something that isn't adapted quite right. There's an example of disutility. Webbed feet on these birds that are upland. They aren't normally near the water. And what's the conclusion? We may safely attribute these structures to inheritance. In other words, common descent. In other words, evolution. They must have evolved. They must have come from an ancestor where it was those webbed feet were useful. So Darwin is got a very powerful argument here for descent. Species come from other species. Inheritance. Now, if you just dropped in from Mars here and just read this paragraph, you might think, well, wait a minute, where's the logic in this? This is not a valid argument. You've got an example of disutility, therefore you know that it was inherited. How could you know that? That doesn't follow. You've got to understand this greater context, the context of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, the theological doctrine that if God created the species, they would be perfectly adapted. Now it makes sense. Now it's a valid argument. You need to understand the context of all this. Now, after Darwin, this argument just continued to be the very powerful argument for evolution. You can find it all through the literature. Here's Jerry Cohen's Why Evolution is True as an example of the apologetic literature, books and articles that follow Darwin in proving and arguing for the truth of evolution, making all these religious arguments. The utilitarian argument shows up a lot. It's a very common, it's ubiquitous in the literature. It is one of the most powerful arguments for evolution, and it is theological. Religion drives science, and it matters.